Hello everybody, welcome back to the Insightful Thinkers podcast. Today we are talking about the information age. What is the information age and how did we get here? And what are the implications of being here in this information age where knowledge is so readily accessible and seemingly is transmitted at such a rapid rate that we can hardly keep up. So, what is the information age? First of all, what is this age that we're living in? Well, the information age is the period beginning in the late 20th century characterized by a rapid shift from traditional industry established by the Industrial Revolution to an economy primarily based upon information technology. So now we are in a situation where what we see and what we perceive and what is communicated is through this digital medium, and it is based upon information technology, and whatever you can create that is something to do in this technological world and create solutions in technology is going to be a main key player in the economy. So it is really a world that now everything is it's digitized and everything is very readily available to us, and things can be communicated so rapidly that they can even be communicated and live streamed across the world, and you can still be watching something that's happening across the world in real time. And that is really an incredible feat of science generally, but it is really a sign of the times as where we are and how easy it is to access information these days. How did we get to this point? Obviously, from the beginnings of history, we were not in this situation where information was so readily accessible. So let's try to trace back to how we got here. So what's the first method of information transfer you can think of to transmit your internal state onto somebody else? Well, this is speech or language. And where did speech begin and how did it begin? There's really no consensus as to when speech started. It seems, according to scientists, that speech developed in like a 100 or 200,000 year period, and it kind of evolved over time rather than just a snap situation and then we get speech all of a sudden. So right now, science has quite a few different scientists have a few different opinions about when speech began, and they're hoping to converge on a more a tighter point, and it is getting a bit narrower as we synthesize data from all sorts of different fields. But right now, it's still a very broad range as to when speech started. So the first stone tools were made about 2.4 million years ago, okay? And this, according to many scientists, indicates linguistic facility, but other scientists argue that tool making is not necessarily associated with speech. So this could not necessarily be the time when speech began. So the idea that I guess some researchers have is that if we're making tools and we are kind of trying to come to some common purpose when we make things, then perhaps we would have needed to be able to communicate in a pretty articulate way to do this. But other scientists say, no, that's not necessarily the case. Now, could it have been as recently as 2 million years ago? What's the evidence that shows that speech could have evolved at that point? Well, the hominid brain 2 million years ago began a period of rapid expansion, including in the primary brain areas associated with producing or processing language, namely the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, in the language centers of the brain. The idea is that if these brain areas rapidly expanded around this point, then perhaps this signified that speech was now perpetuating this increase in size, or the other way around, and these areas were enlarging, and this allowed us to have the capacity to speak and communicate in an incredibly articulate way due to these brain structures and the overall brain development, which happened rapidly around this time. But there's no guarantee that structure fully relates to the function of speech. Often in neuroscience, you hear structure relates to function, and this is true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these structures were used for speaking, for sure, right? And the brain is incredibly plastic, okay? So there are instances where individuals will have a hemispherectomy where one half of their brain is removed, and what you'll find is that the brain areas that were not supposed to be used for one thing now are being used for that thing. There are cases where blind people, sounds can light up their occipital cortex, which is usually used for vision. Okay, but now there's a rerouting of the wiring of the unused brain structure, and the brain is now using that structure to process sounds. Okay, and this is why there actually are blind people who can echolocate, guys. And it may sound crazy, and it's true. Please search it up. There are blind people who know how to echolocate because they have such a large brain region now associated with these sounds. So they make clicks with their tongue, and they can navigate using echolocation and the echo of what's around them. It's very incredible. Please check that out. But it's just to say that just because the Broca's and the Wernicke's area developed a lot about 2 million years ago, it doesn't necessarily mean this was for speech specifically. Okay, so even more recently, could it have been 300,000 years ago? Maybe that speech began. Now, this is when our ancestors had become modern anatomically, and they possessed a larynx located at the top of the trachea, which is lower than in other primates. So this position increases the range of sounds humans can make. But it does make it easier for food to go down the esophagus to be misdirected into the windpipe, leaving us more vulnerable than other animals to choking. So, such anatomy could have developed for no other purpose than speech. If this adaptation is going to make us more likely to choke and to potentially die, then there must be a trade-off. That's something you hear in evolution a lot, is about these trade-offs, about if there's a negative, something is seemingly negative with an adaptation, there's almost always some kind of a benefit as to why, in our case, why did that larynx become located at the top of the trachea, okay, instead of where it was in other primates. So perhaps this could have been to allow us to speak and to communicate, and that has other survival related functions as well. So that would be an interesting trade-off. And these are not my ideas. This is from a paper in Science, actually, and I don't have the exact source with me, but you can read these things about how these trade-offs exist with adaptations, and how they converge on ideas about how this trade-off could have given us more room to be able to speak. Okay, and so this is another idea. About 300,000 years ago is when we really began to speak. Now, even more recently, could it have been 100 to 200,000 years ago? This is a totally different estimate, and this is due to the FOXP2 speech gene, as it's called. And this gene affects both language and the ability to articulate. And this is when this gene underwent its final mutation around this time. So this perhaps laid the groundwork for full linguistic fluency. This is a genetic line of evidence that is showing that it could have been even more recently, or maybe with earlier mutations to the FOXP2 gene, we started to develop speech, but this final mutation laid the final groundwork to be able to fully synthesize it. So the conclusion, guys, is that we don't actually know fully when speech began. And I'm sorry to go off on a little bit of a tangent right at the start of the episode, but I felt it would have been important to really get into the weeds of when we actually started to speak, because this is the first step in information transfer. So I want to do justice to the first step of information transfer along this line of communication methods, right? Now, most researchers are inclined to the view, as I mentioned, that language gradually emerged over perhaps a couple 100,000 years. Steven Pinker is one of the foremost researchers in this area. Harvard psychologist, and he says that all we know for certain is that fully developed language was in place by at least 50,000 years ago, when humans in Europe were creating art and burying the dead. These symbolic behaviors point unequivocally to fluent language. This is Steven Pinker, and I don't specifically know if this is from a book or from an article, but he's the author of The Language Instinct and other books like The Blank Slate that we went over a few episodes ago. And Pinker says that it was these symbolic behaviors, and he can say it a lot better than I can. I don't fully know why symbolic behaviors necessarily, and burying the dead and things like this, necessarily mean we needed to have speech. He can explain this far better than I can, but this is what the experts are saying, and he argues that language must have played a role in transmitting some kind of symbolic behaviors over the generations or within generations and to other people. Okay, what's the next way we started to communicate our internal states to other people? Well, I already kind of made mention of it. This is through cave paintings. The Paleolithic people began around 50,000 years ago to scratch and paint shapes inside of caves. And like Pinker says, this is around the time that symbolic behavior began to emerge. So this is the first recording of mental states in external media. With speech, it comes and it disappears. Well, tis no longer the case because this podcast, this will never disappear. And this is part of what we're going to talk about in the future, about how now we're in the information age and knowledge is so much more accessible. What I'm speaking can be recorded and it'll be online forever, right? Speech, it had always been the case that speech just disappears and your mental state just is in thin air now. But these cave paintings showed that now this speech is represented on external media and it can last forever. Your thoughts are being transmitted and permanently, okay? And this is about 50,000 years ago. Another way that your internal state can be transmitted permanently is through writing. So the first recorded writing was in about 3000 BC, and it was Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs that appeared around this time. And it's debated whether Egyptian writing was developed independently of Sumerian or if it was a case of cultural diffusion between the cultures. But either way, it was around 2000 to 3000 BC when these writings started to begin to emerge. Another way of representing your internal state on external media. And there was a quote from the English author Samuel Butler. He said, "The written symbol extends infinitely as regards time and space, the range within which one mind can communicate with another. It gives the writer's mind a life. It allows your mind to permeate across generations and across all time until it goes away." In the case of, for instance, the Library of Alexandria, when it was burned down and all the knowledge supposedly of the world was washed away or burned down. But your mind can essentially be represented for all time is the idea with writing. And this started quite recently when you look at the broad picture. As recently as about 2000 to 3000 BC. There were also the talking drums. These were discovered in the early 19th century by the missionary Roger T. Clark. And the origin of talking drums is in sub-Saharan Africa, but the date of origin is unknown. It was discovered in the 1800s, but we don't know how long the Africans have been using these talking drums to communicate. How did these talking drums work? How did Africans communicate using drums? Well, by imitating the rhythm and the rise and fall of words and languages, the sounds of the drums can communicate messages such as tribal news for up to 20 miles. So by making the sounds on these drums, they can communicate and essentially speak to one another through music. And one of the early discoveries this was of something that was now more efficient than carrying message by horseback, which is what the missionaries like Roger T. Clark were doing. And they were carrying message by horseback. And imagine if they had to go 20 miles. That would take a lot longer than the echo of the drum or the sound of the drum that transmits that far to other members in the village. So this was definitely a notable advance along this road to communicating with one another and this history of information transfer. Now we fast forward all the way to the 1800s, when we finally began to harness the power of electricity. And we really began to harness the power of electricity with the telegraph in the early 1800s. So a journalist speaking on the telegraph said, intelligence, thus hastily gathered and transmitted, has its drawbacks and is not so trustworthy as the news, which starts later and travels slower. So this quote, it actually applies quite greatly to today, how information is so hastily gathered today, and it is so easily accessible. It is not fact-checked. A tweet can be sent out by the president, and it can have 1 million people believing something that is totally not true. But because it comes out so quickly, we're inclined to just believe it. And this is what this journalist kind of said, these things that apply to today, because he said with the telegraph, the information is transmitted so much more quickly, but this isn't as reliable as the news when it has to be reviewed and it gets transmitted slowly. There's almost more time for fact checking. There's more thought put into what is going to be read, and that also associates to the medium with which information is transmitted, because when it was like the paper news, the newspaper, with reading, it takes a lot more cognitive capacity to sit and focus and read something than it does to just hear something, for instance, through the telegraph, like in his case, or over the airways, like we hear today. For instance, imagine if I was to write these things that I'm saying right now. It would be more nuanced, and I would have to fact check a little bit better and make sure every single thing was right, because the medium with which I'm communicating this is through writing, and people are going to pay more attention to it rather than through the podcast, when you could be driving to work, you could be cooking, you could be cleaning up. You're listening almost passively in a way, and if you notice while you listen to something, you kind of go in and out of what you're hearing, and that's why it is kind of a little bit harder to understand when you're listening, because the medium is it's more of a passive thing. So that's what this journalist was saying. He was saying when there is something that is the information is more hastily gathered and hastily transmitted, it might not be as reliable as something written down. But either way, that was a great advance, the telegraph was, and it led eventually to the telephone in the late 1800s with the patent of Alexander Graham Bell. I believe 1867. Please correct me on that if I'm wrong. And after this, we get straight to the information age. And it's no longer some linear route of advances where you list telegraph, telephone, talking drums before that, iPhone, because now what's happening is that there's such a proliferation of these technologies that we can't even keep up. I can't say, oh, then this computer was made, but then this advancement in computing, and it's just completely burgeoned into into the information age, which is where we're at now. Information is now readily accessible and can be consumed in incredibly efficient ways, like through cell phones and computers and iPads and things like this. So, to show this, this became evident to me even while I was researching for this podcast, because a lot of the thoughts from here are coming from the book The Information by James Gleick, and he talks about the same stuff. So, for instance, that quote from the journalist, that is actually coming from what he wrote in the book, and what was happening when I was researching for this book was. Or for this podcast, when I was reading the book, I had it in Audible in my ears, and I also had it on the computer screen, scrolling automatically. There's an auto scroll feature on Adobe PDF, and it allows me to play the book at a faster rate in my ear, because if I'm paying attention to the words and the words spoken to me, I can listen to it a little bit faster. So all this to say that look how easy it is to transmit information today and how accessible information is. I mean, I've got 2 sources of an incredibly written book all surrounding me because of technology, because we're in this information age. 100 years ago, this would have been completely impossible. I mean, let alone even being able to use Google to find a book like this. I can just find exactly the book I want. I can play it in my ears, look at it on the screen, and it is allowing for so much growth cognitively. But there are caveats to that, and it doesn't necessarily mean your mind is going to grow just because there's more information around you, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this newfound information age, could it be unlocking a lot of our human potential, since our minds are limited not by the capacity to store information, but rather by the ability to reliably and quickly access it. The brain has no trouble storing a whole host of information. Just look at people on Jeopardy. I mean, their brain, it's not like when they learn a new fact, their brain says, no space in the memory. It's funny because I was actually just recording this episode, and luckily early on in the episode, it ran out of memory and I had to restart. But our brain is not like that. It won't ever say memory card full and shut down the recording. It's going to keep processing it in almost every case. What limits us is our ability to access information reliably and quickly. And now that barrier is gone, and I can Google something and I can get the book immediately and I can order it 2-day delivery. Now I have that knowledge in my head. Now that barrier is gone, this could unlock a lot of human potential, and it can allow us to consume more information individually. And now we have more information to share. We have more ideas to share, and we can make more advances at a more rapid rate, So if we can effectively access information, we can really use this knowledge to generate more when we share it with other people. And look what's happening now with the podcast. And I get this information from this source, and then I get it from this source, and then I can sync it up, and I learn about neuroscience here, and then I learn about the information age here, and then that syncs up to the way I think about how the brain works, and then I communicate it through this medium, and then you guys listen, and then you guys have your own ideas, and then you share that back with me, and then that makes me think of a new thing that I didn't think of in the first place. What I'm just getting at is the fact that information now is the access to information we have can unlock a new level of advancement if we let it. And that's part of the reason why we're doing the video calls monthly with members of InsightfulThinkers fans and you guys and I, because it allows for this sharing of information, and it allows us to generate our own ideas. Now, there's something called the Flynn Effect. The Flynn Effect, named after the researcher who discovered it, Robert Flynn, I believe it was. I don't want to get this wrong because I don't like getting facts, especially on psychology, wrong. But you know what? I don't know if it was Robert Flynn. But let's Google this and let's get this right for you guys. So the Flynn Effect, let's see who discovered it. James Flynn. Okay, there we go. James Flynn discovered the Flynn Effect. And what is the Flynn Effect? So over time, the average IQ is rising at a rate of about 3 points per decade. So our IQs on average are a full 10 to 15 points higher than those of our grandparents. Why is this the case? Most researchers agree that this effect is a result of environmental influences on IQ, because it's unlikely that genetic changes could account for such rapid rises in IQ over such brief time periods. There's no way there could have been new adaptations that came in the population in only 2 generations that allowed us to just all of a sudden have so much higher IQ than our grandparents. What are the contributing factors that allowed this to become the case? So researchers argue that it could be nutrition, it could be improvements in schooling, And it could be the advances in technology, which we experience now in the information age. And I want to focus on that third one. And it's not to discount the other two, because there is a whole host of research that support each one of these routes to us gaining higher IQ. But in light of what we're discussing today, I want to talk about how this advance in technology could have maybe played a role in the Flynn effect and in allowing our brains to grow cognitively. So there's an increased consumption of information due to the newfound mediums that make information so accessible today. For instance, kids, essentially straight from birth, consume a litany of sights and sounds from numerous devices, and this increased consumption provides an enhanced environmental stimulation, perhaps giving the minds of children more cognitive tools at an earlier age. It's well known that the brain cannot exist in isolation or in a vat, as you might say. It needs environmental stimulation to work correctly and to wire itself correctly over development. The brain is not fully developed at birth. Environmental stimulation greatly impacts the way the brain develops. How do we know this? It started with Hubel and Wiesel, two experimenters in the mid-20th century who did experiments on ocular deprivation in cats. So overall, what they found was that if you deprive cats from enough stimulation, their visual cortex, their striatum, their V1, is not going to respond correctly to the stimulation they were missing. If you block their right eye, neurons that are supposed to respond to that right eye are not going to really be activated in that striatum. And I'm pointing to the back because that's where the visual cortex is. And if you deprive the left eye, the neurons responding to that eye are not going to be as active. All this to say that you need environmental stimulation for your brain to work correctly. This has also been found in, quite unfortunately, in cases of deprived children. There was a child named Jeannie who for the first 13 years of her life was totally deprived of stimulation, and she suffered great abuse, and all she basically received was food. It was a horrible story, but what we did find was, and she didn't know how, when she was discovered, she did not know how to speak. She hardly knew how to walk. And all of these things just to show that if you don't get enough stimulation, you are not going to be able to develop correctly. So the idea is that in this information age, with so much more stimulation and more perhaps educational stimuli coming in from such an early age, I know everyone's seen the little kids or toddlers on their iPads, then maybe this will enhance cognitive capacity as you develop because of this enhanced stimulation. All the colors, the sights, the sounds, the things you're seeing, it's not the same as it used to be, and frankly it's more extreme. And just kind of an anecdote, demonstrating the effect of the environment on the way we think as well. I was one time just getting some food somewhere, and an engineering student, I was in the engineering building, and the engineering student, I overheard him explaining a concept to his friend using an analogy of a y-intercept. Now, this is something that I would have never thought of using in an analogy, let alone knowing how to use it effectively. And it seems as if because he was intertwined in this area with y-intercepts and with whatever he was learning. I did not do an engineering degree. I don't know what he was learning. But either way, him and his friends seemed to understand what this analogy meant because he used the y-intercept. So basically what I'm trying to say is that because I didn't learn, well, I know what a y-intercept is, but because I didn't, I wasn't in that world and I didn't really learn advanced things about it like he did in engineering, I would not know how to use that analogy effectively. But I could talk all you want about the brain or psychology, and that's kind of the area that I know a little better. So all this to say that the environment really impacts the way we develop, it impacts the way we think, and it may, perhaps with this increased stimulation in the information age, these are having salubrious effects on the way we're able to think and the way our brain is able to develop. Even if you do a thought exercise of, for instance, the next idea that you have, break down the concepts within it. Think about all the facts and ideas that are intertwined within supposedly your idea. And you'll find that you can only have an idea as advanced as the shared cognitive foundation that's in place. That engineering student, a couple thousand years ago, well, I actually don't know when the Cartesian plane and the y-intercept stuff began. Well, a couple thousand years ago, we'll say, how could he have made that analogy? There's no way his brain could have even thought to make that analogy because that concept didn't even exist. Look at the ancient Egyptians. It would have been impossible to make advances in digital technology, no matter how many other groundbreaking ideas they had. The shared foundation simply just was not in place for them to even dream up something like an iPhone. So the environment really dictates the way we think, and we have to realize that. So the information age, with such rapid transmission of ideas between people, gives us an opportunity, at least, to build on ideas and make advancements at a much faster rate. But the caveat that I had mentioned earlier in the episode is, this is only an opportunity. And there remain many ways in which having the knowledge of the world at our fingertips is not necessarily conducive to a greater rate of advancements, okay? Now, a barrage of content, it so often fails to tell us what we need to know, and consumption of information does not necessarily lead to knowledge, let alone wisdom. This is a quote directly from The Information by James Gleick. Now, just because you consume more information today on your social media and all these things, it doesn't necessarily mean you will have more knowledge or let alone wisdom than anyone could have had before the information age, right? The psychologist Siegfried Struffert discovered in the 1960s that the relationship between information load and information handling typically resembled an inverted U. So what does this mean? So he found that more information at first is helpful, but then it's not so helpful. It starts to peak out and plateau a little bit, and then it's actually harmful on your ability to process what you're taking in. So maybe the information age, with all this information, this barrage of information that's all around us, maybe it's actually harmful in processing what we actually need to focus on, guys. Maybe it's not all positive for this information age. The Professor Jacob Palm just discussed the nature of the email all the way back in 1980, and this quote really applies to today. He said, people get too many messages which they do not have time to read. This also means that the really important messages are difficult to find in a large flow of less important messages. In the future, when we get larger and larger message systems, and these systems get more and more interconnected, this will be a problem for almost all users of these systems. Look how relevant this quote is for today as well. And this is from 1980, when email was just starting to come up onto the scene. And he says, when we get, he says, really important messages, when you have too many of them, they will get buried in the flow and you'll end up looking at less important messages first. You can liken this to how social media can distract you. For instance, if you're reading a textbook, and how many times will you be in the library and you say you're studying all day, but when you really break it down, how many times do you get distracted and go onto your phone because there's so much information and stuff on there that it actually distracted you from what you were supposed to be learning? So this information age, just because there's more information out there, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make us smarter necessarily, right? If we're not careful, okay? So attention actually is now the limiting factor for information consumption rather than access to information as it once was. So back in the day, you just simply couldn't get your hands on an educational book, okay? But now, these books get lost in the shuffle. Okay, and distractions steal our attention before we can even access the information we want. So just going on Google or going on YouTube, this has actually happened to me today when I went on YouTube and I was actually going to search something that I needed to know. But then my home feed, it showed me like 5 videos that I was super interested in. And by then I forgot I had them all to my watch later, whatever. By then I forgot what I actually came to YouTube for. It's kind of like when you walk in a room and you forget why you walked into that room, or little things like this. There's so much information around that it steals your attention before you can even get to where you want to go. And when you do find that information, and if I did end up finding the information that I was looking for, I'd be hard pressed to pay attention to it because I'm flooded with all sorts of peripheral information. So even if I did find what I wanted, I'd still be on YouTube, and in the bottom, it would still be showing me recommended videos, or something else would pop up, a notification on my phone, and take me out of there. So it's very difficult these days in the information age, and I kind of wanted to paint both sides of the picture of, yes, there's a chance that the information age could promote a greater rate of development personally and societally, but we also have to consider what could happen if we don't play it right, and we aren't conscious of the information we consume. Now, what about the prospect of, for instance, doing research in the information age? It seems as if there are more questions than answers, because only limited progress to solving initial problems can be made before new ideas come. So in other words, there's almost like there's more input coming into your mind than output. It's hard to become enthralled by one specific idea because there's so many ideas out there that get fed to you, and it's not hard to be interested in all sorts of different things these days. And how do I possibly research one thing if there are so many things popping up in front of me that I'm interested in? Perhaps it would have been a lot easier when back in the day it was harder to access information, and you know what, I just have to settle for this thing that I like, and I'm going to pursue this my whole life because I don't really know what else I could possibly like. This is the book I have, and this is what I almost have to be interested in and have to pursue. It becomes difficult, and when there's so much input, it's hard to match that with your output that you put out, for instance, as a researcher or things like this. So it's almost as if we know less about more in the information age, you guys. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't really know. I hope I communicated at least arguments for both sides, and I believe both of those sides do hold true in a certain way. And in the end, it's just all about how you operate within this information age, and you understand at least that there is a lot of information out there, and it's not about consuming every piece of it you see, perhaps. It's about avoiding this distraction. And there are all sorts of books about how to do this, and one book that I want to read is The Organized Mind. Daniel Levitin, I believe it is, and he talks about how, I think the subtitle is Thinking Straight in the Age of Information Overload. And perhaps this is kind of what I need to read next. And who knows, maybe that will become a podcast episode if there are enough insights from that I can find. I did want to talk slightly about the future of the information age. Where are we going to go from here? The only thing I could think of was a possibility for zero latency information access. Right now, there is a small latency from when you, a small delay from when you want to know something and then when you're able to know it. Like, I still do have to search Google. I have to Google information age books, and however quickly I can type, it's not like just like that. And the idea is that maybe in the future, right when I want to know something, I'll be able to know it, and that's going to be another level. And I wouldn't put it past a lot of the researchers and scientists to be able to create that somehow. And I hate to bring up Neuralink in another episode because it doesn't seem like it's necessarily the main promising team that's on the frontier of this, because I don't think we're close to getting to this point. But either way, that's what Neuralink kind of wants to do. They want to create this rapid access to kind of whatever knowledge you need, at least from what I've heard. It's a possibility. You never know. But the brain is incredibly complex, and there's no guarantee that thinking about a want to understand something can necessarily be translated into an automatic access to that, because you would have to be able to read the brain circuits that fire specifically when you want to do certain things, and then it would have to be able to read that and then give you that information rapidly. And how would they even give you that information? Would they put it on the screen without you even saying anything? And would that even be effective? I mean, I can literally say, I don't want to say, but Siri, and I can ask Siri whatever, and that's quick enough, right? So I mean, how much more quick do we really want to be able to access information, guys? These are just thoughts about kind of the future of the information age. If you guys have other thoughts, please share those with me. Share those with me in the comments section. Share those on the Connect page of the website, you guys. And we're really looking to communicate ideas with one another, share ideas with one another. That's what this is for. And we're very small right now, and we're going to continue to grow, and eventually it's going to be an open kind of outlet to discuss a lot of things with one another. And it's no longer just going to be me saying whatever. It's going to be with you guys as well. So if you want to join this monthly ITP video conference call where we can actually discuss some of these ideas together, you can support the podcast on Patreon. So this is where we come together monthly to have insightful discussions and to analyze topics. I told you guys you can share your own ideas if you want. You can do it through the Connect page on the website. It sends to me through an email, and that would be for longer form things, or you can do it through the comments. And if you are on the comments on YouTube, and if you are on the website, check out the blog posts. There are poems on there, and there are also other articles as well. If you liked this episode, guys, and if you like what you're seeing or what you're hearing with Insightful Thinkers Media and the Insightful Thinkers podcast, please share it with anyone else who's interested in each topic that I talk about. Whether you just tell them about it, if they like the information age, or if a friend would like it, or you share it on social media or whatever to whoever you think would be interested in, guys. Let's try to keep sharing it through word of mouth, and we'll get a larger community of people to discuss these things with. And you can subscribe to the podcast as well if you like this episode on any platform you're listening on, whether it's Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else. Apple Podcasts, it allows you to leave a rating and a review, and YouTube allows you to like the video if you liked it, you guys. And that's just about it. The Information Age. What are we going to title this one? The Information Age and its Implications, maybe, or the History of Information Transfer, something like that. But I'm glad we got to talk about it today, and this was a cool one. This was a cool one for sure, and so many great advances that have gotten us here into this place where we can now communicate so quickly with one another. And I just thought it really kind of captured me, this idea. So this was a good one today. I like this one, and we'll keep moving. Next week we're going to be doing weekly episodes, you guys. So I'm thinking every week, every Monday, something like that. I don't really know the date, but we're going to just do weekly, keep doing it. And I'm still getting into the flow. I know I've said that it's been a while now, but we're creating the schedule. We're starting things up now. So I hope you guys are enjoying it. Stick along with me for the ride. And thank you guys for tuning in to the Insightful Thinkers podcast. We'll be back soon with more in-depth analysis into a diverse set of topics. Take care, everybody.